In this video, I'm going to go through the Gloves Made 5 Ways knitting pattern that I have written that make gloves in 5 different ways. Now, the pattern starts the same for all of them, and then you make a few adjustments to get the different types. We have a fingerless mitt, fingerless gloves that have actual finger gussets, a full glove that has full fingers on it, a mitten, and then a convertible mitten that is a fingerless glove that has a flap that can turn it into a mitten and cover up your fingers. This video is going to focus on the first one of these, which is the fingerless mitten. This is the easiest one of all these to make. Now, I say easiest, but this is not a necessarily easy pattern. I would consider this to be an intermediate pattern, at least an advanced beginner to intermediate pattern, because we're going to be knitting in the round and using double pointed needles. So I want to talk to you for a few minutes about that. These are double pointed needles. They, of course, have a point at both ends, and they're used when knitting in the round to knit things that are knitted into tubes, like a glove would be, or socks, or things like that. This pattern uses 2 different sizes, a smaller one to do the ribbed cuff portion, and then you switch to a larger one to do the body of the glove. So I'm going to kind of go slow with with this in the beginning with the double point needles, just to show you how this is kind of an introduction to knitting in the round with these DP ends. So this pattern starts out using the smaller set of needles, and double point needles usually come in a set of 4 or 5. I have the 2 different sizes here, and I have four of each of them. You'll need 4 of each for this pattern. So we'll start with the smaller ones here, and worsted weight yarn. It calls for 200 yards of worsted weight yarn, which is basically 1 ball. And another little thing about this, you see here, this was color changing yarn that I used. It self stripes as you knit with it. This is entirely up to you. When I'm knitting with something that is self striping like this, I like to have both of my gloves match so that the stripes are the same, or at least as close to the same as they can be. So I'll show you a little trick on how to do that. I started this one, and I made note of where I started it in my colorway here. So I'm going to just find that same location on this ball of yarn, which was right where it changes from pink to purple, is where I started. So it would be right here. And that is where I'm going to put my slip knot to begin my cast on. So to cast on these stitches onto these double point needles, you do it the same way that you would with regular knitting needles or even circular knitting needles. So to do this, you simply put your slip knot on your double pointed needle and tighten it up just like you would, and we're going to use the standard long tail cast on, where we make our little slingshot with our yarn, go under the thumb, around the finger, and then cast on a stitch. So we're just using regular long tail cast on, and I have a video on how to cast on. I will link here as well if you need a refresher on that. And you cast on basically the number of stitches that the pattern tells you to here. Now, I am going to cast all of these stitches onto the same needle. I find it easier to do it that way. We're going to cast all these stitches on, and then we're going to split them up between 3 other needles, or 2 other needles, 3 needles total. You can cast in, by all means, you can cast on each needle individually. I just find that hard to do. So I cast all of my stitches onto the same needle. So let me get them cast on here. And as you see, I have knitted 1 of each of the different types of gloves that are available in this pattern. And we are going to just go through a series of videos here knitting the matching glove to go with each of them. It tells you in the pattern how many stitches to put onto each needle. So to do that, let's say that these are all my stitches that I would need. I just grab another needle, slide these down to the end where that second point is, and then just slip them off like that onto that needle. And when I'm done slipping stitches onto this one, I'll pick up my second needle and slip the number of stitches that I need on my second needle. Onto that as well. So continue casting on, and when you are ready to begin actually knitting, join me back here and we will get started. So to start knitting this, we are going to take the needle where we stopped casting on. So there's our last cast on stitch on this needle. This is the third needle. We're going to pick up the first needle in that group, and we're going to join these together in a kind of a triangle shape. So to do this, you'll take this first needle, put your knitting needle in, which is your fourth needle that had nothing on it. This is going to be the one that we use to knit these stitches off. So you put that in, you take your working yarn, making sure to keep your stitches all going the same way so they're not twisted. Wrap that around and knit a stitch off. And that first stitch, sometimes when you're transitioning from one needle to the other, tends to be a little loose. I like to make sure I pull that nice and snug and kind of hold it in place as I'm doing my second stitch here. So the first part of this pattern is we're working in a 2x2 rib. So I've just knitted my first 2 stitches. I'm then going to bring my yarn in between my needles and purl the next 2. Oops. And then move it back through the needles and knit the next 2. And if you need a refresher on how to do ribbing, I have a video on that as well that I will link here too. But we're just going to continue this way, knitting and purling until we get all the way to the end of that first needle. And you can kind of adjust your needles if they're getting in your way. I like to, after I've knitted a few stitches, I like to take this third needle and move it below the one that I'm knitting onto. It just gives me a little bit more freedom to move around. Let's see, we just did 2 purl, so we're going to do 2 knit. And then we'll finish up with 2 purl on that first needle. Now you'll notice we've come to the end of that first needle. All of our stitches have been moved over to that fourth needle that we started, and we now have a bare needle. We're going to use this one to knit the stitches off of the next needle. So we finished up this needle, we're going to turn, and we're going to start on the second needle. Now, the way this pattern is set up, the stitches are split amongst the 3 needles so that every needle, as you're doing the ribbing pattern, every needle starts with knit stitches. That's just a pet peeve of mine. I don't like to start on a purl stitch. I find that a little more difficult. So this is going to be a knit, so we're going to make sure that that yarn is pulled to the back. We're going to put our needle in, and just like we did with that first needle, we're going to knit that stitch off, pull it snug, hold it in place, knit your 2, and then continue your ribbing pattern. And you'll just do the same. You will come to the end of this needle, you'll let go of that one that you were using. You'll take the newly empty needle and start ribbing pattern on your next one. So, and this is what you'll do. You'll just continue around. We'll do the third needle. Once we're done with that, we'll spin around and we'll start back on the first needle again. And we just keep knitting around and around and around that circle until our cuff is as long as the pattern tells us. And you'll know, some people like to put a marker or something, a little clip-on stitch marker, so they know when they've come to the end of the round. I never bother with that during this portion of it, just because I have my cast-on tail here. So when I get to the cast-on tail, I know that's where I stopped casting on. That's the end of my round. And so the next needle is going to be the beginning of the next round. So that's how you can always tell that. So just continue doing this. When you are done knitting the cuff and ready for the next step, I will meet you back here and we'll move on with our pattern. Okay, so we have our cuff, the ribbed section here, as big as we would like it. And the next part of the pattern tells you to switch to stockinette stitch. Now, when you are knitting stockinette stitch in the round, ordinarily with stockinette, you knit one side, you turn your work, and then you purl the other side so that all of your little V stitches line up on the same side. With knitting in the round, you're not knitting back and forth. You're knitting in a constant spiral. So to knit stockinette in the round, you're basically just going to knit all the stitches. You never have to purl in order to get your stockinette. So you'll just switch over to stockinette. You'll just start knitting all of the stitches. And you'll do this. It tells you how many rows in the pattern to do this for a few rows. But because we're not going back and forth and purling, this tends to go fairly quickly. Just like this. So there's one round of just stockinette. Then you just continue on for however many rounds it tells you of stockinette. And when you are done with that, I will meet you back here for the next little tricky part of this glove. So I have my cuff and now my rows of just plain stockinette. And the next thing the pattern tells us to do is we're going to switch over to our larger sized needles. So to do this, I'm just going to pick up one of the larger needles and start knitting, because the next step is to knit the first needle's worth of stitches. So I'm just going to use the next size larger needle and knit those stitches off. Then that smaller needle that I just finished, I'm just going to set it aside, grab one of my larger needles here. And on needle number 2, we're going to start setting aside stitches for, or creating stitches for our thumb gusset. So for the thumb area here, we're going to start adding stitches to the round so that we have room to actually put a thumb in our glove. So to do this, the pattern tells us to knit the first 5 stitches. So I'll use my larger needle and knit the first 5 stitches. Then I'm going to place a marker on this to know where my thumb gusset's going to start. And then I'm going to do what's called knit in the front and back, or KFB for short. You put your needle in like you're going to knit, wrap your yarn, pull up a stitch. Then instead of dropping that previous stitch off, you twist around, put your needle back into the same stitch, wrap it again, and pull a second stitch up, and then pull that old stitch off. So you essentially make an extra stitch. You get 2 stitches out of 1 by doing that. And we're going to do this twice. So there is my second KFB. Then I put my next marker on. And then knit the last 5 stitches in the row, or on the needle. to finish off this needle. So if we look at this here, our increases are going to start coming in between these two markers, and will increase ever so often according to our pattern. You'll finish out this row, then you'll knit 2 more rows of stockinette, and then you'll do another increase, and then 2 more rows of stockinette, and then another increase, and you keep increasing until you have enough stitches to create your thumb according to the pattern. So continue following along with your pattern, and when you have finished your increase section, I'll meet you back here to show you what to do with those stitches. Alright, let's see if I can do this with a cat interrupting me here. Here's where we've made it to so far in the pattern. We have finished all of our stitches for the thumb gusset. We've done all of our increases here, and you can see a little V has formed here of extra stitches. And we're going to slip those off because we don't need them just yet. So we're going to knit the first 5 stitches over to this stitch marker. And then you can just take that stitch marker off. Then pick up a yarn needle or darning needle and a scrap piece of yarn. About, oh, I don't know, 6-8 inches long or so. Put your yarn on your darning needle, and we're going to just put this needle through these extra stitches that we made here. So you just slide them all over. And just slide them off onto that scrap piece of yarn, and then they'll just hang there. Now you can get rid of your other stitch marker, and then just continue knitting the last 5 stitches of that row. Make sure you pull that first stitch tight, as you're closing up a gap there. And you see here what has happened. We've essentially pulled those thumb stitches off, and now we have a thumb gusset. And then we'll just continue knitting around just these stitches that are on our 3 needles here. I think that the pattern tells you how far. I think it's 4 inches, 4.5 inches, something like that, until it's that length. So I'm going to do that, and then I'll meet you back here for the last little bit of this pattern. Okay, so here's where we are in our pattern. We have knitted in stockinette for a certain number of inches, and then switched back to ribbing and did like 1.5 inches or so, or however long you would like it to be, in ribbing here at the end. Now, the pattern does tell you a certain number of inches for each one. Everybody's hand is different. These were made based on taking measurements of my own hand, which is, you know, just a regular medium-sized hand here. You know, the best way, if you're making these for yourself, you can always put these on as you're making them and make sure that they're going to fit properly. So, you know, if you want the ribbing to come up a little higher, you can always continue it up a little higher if you want. But I am satisfied with the length that this one is, so we're going to bind off. And the pattern tells you to bind off loosely, so I'm going to show you, I mean, there's all kinds of different ways to bind off loosely. I'm going to show you my favorite way. It's a stretchy bind off. I like to use it for the cuffs of socks and also gloves, just because you want this to be a little stretchy at the top. You don't want it to be bound around your fingers pretty tight. So this gives it a little bit of flexibility. So I'll show you how we do that here with the ribbing portion of it. So we're going to start knitting this in the same pattern. So we're going to do our first 2 knits here. And then ordinarily when you bind off, you would just pick this stitch up, drop it over off the needle over top of the stitch you just knit. But what we're going to do here, since these are knit stitches, we're going to knit them through the back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my left needle here, put it back through those stitches so that my right needle is in the back, and I'm just going to knit those two stitches together. Now, we're going to switch over to ribbing, or to a purl stitch, since we're doing our ribbing. So I'm going to bring my yarn in between my needles. I'm going to purl that stitch. And since the stitch that I just did was a purl, I'm going to knit these two together through the front. So I'm going to take my my left needle, put it through those stitches in the back, and I'm going to purl these off together. I said knitting through the front. Really, we're purling is what we're doing. So we're purling those off. Then the next one is another purl stitch. So I'm going to purl it, put my needle back in through the back, and then purl those together. Now in ribbing, of course, my next one now, we're doing 2x2, so this one's a knit. So I'm going to knit, and since that most recent stitch was a knit stitch, we're going to knit these through the back. This is a little tricky here. There we go. And then I'll knit this one, and since that's a knit stitch, we're going to knit them through the back. Now bring my yarn forward because we're going to purl these, and since this one's a purl stitch, then we're going to purl them together. And now we've got them all bound off, and you notice then there's quite a bit of stretch to that bind off, so it's not going to be so tight on your fingers. So the next step then is we've got to finish off the thumb here. So we have these stitches that we put onto our scrap piece of yarn, and I'm going to pick them back up off of this piece of yarn. So I'm going to pick up, just putting my needle back through those loops. And that last needle, and then just pull your scrap yarn out so that you have your stitches on your needles here. Then I'm just going to reattach my yarn, and we're going to begin knitting around. So I'm going to put my needle in that first stitch, pick up my yarn, just loop it around, and knit that first stitch off, and then just continue knitting around. We're going to pick up a couple of stitches out of the side of this. Now, to pick up some extra stitches, I'm going to just take the tip of my needle, put it in between a stitch that's part of the body of the glove, wrap my yarn around, and then just pull a stitch up through, and that gives me an extra stitch. And I'm going to do this one on either side of this little gap here. You see we have this little gap. So I'm going to do that one stitch on either side just to bring that gap together. And then we just continue knitting around. And you'll just keep knitting this around. It tells you a certain number of rows to do. You can do however long you want it. Put it on, measure it. Whenever it's as long enough as you want it for your thumb, then you can bind off. So this is, this is a fingerless one, so you just take it as far as you want. And then we're going to do the same stretchy bind off that we did here. But since these are all knit stitches, you'll just be knitting 2 and then knitting those through the back together, and then knitting the next one, and then you'll just keep doing the knitting through the back loop on them, instead of alternating between knitting through the back loop and purling 2 together. Since we're not doing ribbing, it's just straight knitting through here. All right, so I hope that helps. Just keep on going. If you decide to work on any of the other gloves that are in this pattern, I will have tutorials up for those shortly. Once I finish this glove, I will move on with the next one in the instruction set. And if you do make any of these, let me know. Put a comment below or post a picture or something. Let me see what your gloves look like that you've made from this pattern. I'd be happy to see that. All right. So there you go.